Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyarazi, also known as Mutos, and welcome to the Connection Desk. This next couple of sessions, I'll be talking about how the church moved from being Jew to Gentile. Okay, so we're taking a bit of a break from Acts chapter 15. In Acts 15, from Acts chapter 14, we're about to enter Acts chapter 15. And in Acts 15 is a very pivotal moment. It's a significant shift. A significant shift was about to happen in the church. And from there on, things changed forever. Acts chapter 15, from there on, things changed. The direction of the church changed forever. And even up to now, we are still living on the ramifications of the decisions that were made in the book of Acts chapter 15. But before we go into Acts chapter 15, I want us to have a bit of a background and an understanding of the issues facing the church at that conference, or at that council, the Jerusalem council that happened in Acts 15. So a bit of a backdrop. We've touched on some of this already, but I want to make sure that before we get into Acts 15, we've got a clear understanding of the issues at hand and the journey, the cultural journey that the people had gone through to this point. So the Jewishness of the early church is something that we must understand if we really are going to understand what God was doing in that first century. So the earliest church in the first few chapters of Acts was totally Jewish. It was totally Jewish. There were no Gentiles in it. And it was monocultural. In fact, maybe, we do see different languages and different background as we move on. In fact, in Acts chapter 2 is the first time that you begin to see that there were different backgrounds, different languages. On the day of Pentecost, when the diaspora Jews would come back to their land and were worshiping. So in Acts 2, is maybe the first time you begin to see that, the different languages. But then as you go on and you go into Acts chapter 6, you see the influence of the Gentiles, but still it was a community that consisted of people of Jewish birth. So if the people were not of Jewish birth, they had been absorbed into the Jewish faith. That's how things were. So either you were of Jewish birth or you were absorbed into the Jewish faith. That was the people that consisted of the early church, or the early church consisted of this kind of people. And their priorities and concerns were completely Jewish. So in their early understanding of Jesus, to them Jesus was the answer and fulfillment to Israel's history, hopes, and concerns. And he was the fulfillment of the prophecies around the Davidic Messiah. He was fulfilling their nationalistic aspirations. He was the Son of Man, the righteous human judge of the world, and he was the suffering servant. He sacrificed himself for the salvation of his people. All these images are coming from the Old Testament, and they are prophetic images that we see in the books of the prophet of how the Lord Jesus was seen, the early understanding, and how Israel would have understood the Lord Jesus Christ. So the people of God, Israel as a nation. Let's unpack this a little bit more. God's relationship with human beings actually started with the whole world. He didn't start with the nation of Israel. He started with the whole world. He was the creator of heaven and earth, the one from whom all creation is derived. So there was a God who created heaven and earth. All creation comes from him. And at Babel, we have a significant shift in the relationship between God and humans. And God scattered them and gave them new languages. We see that in Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. And in addition to scattering them and giving them a new language, we see in Deuteronomy that he assigned them to lesser gods or lesser divine beings. Now, this is an important part of this, to understand the worldview, the Jewish and the first century worldview, so that the nations were not only scattered to go and speak other languages and scattered to different parts, but they were actually assigned to different gods. Where do we get this from? Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8 and 9 makes this most clear, but then there are other sections that we will touch on. But Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, it's very, very clear. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. This is the ESV translation. And the ESV translation here is better than, or actually takes a better, in my opinion, takes a better position than the NIV and some of other interpretations, because other interpretations would say the sons of Israel, that the borders of the peoples according to the numbers of the sons of Israel. And that doesn't really make much sense when you begin to fully unpack it. It makes much better sense if you say the sons of God. And also in the Old Testament, the Septuagint, which is the translation that the believers in the New Testament would have been reading, or people in the first century would have been reading the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, they go with Elohim as the sons of God. Okay, so the Hebrew word here was that, and the word sons of God is also used in the book of Job, when the sons of God appeared before God. And of course, we are talking about angelic beings, we're talking about divine beings there. So the sons of God language is language that we are dealing with divine beings, and the nations were assigned to different divine beings. And this, the assertion and implication of this verse is that certain angels are responsible for specific nations. And then verse 9 of Deuteronomy 32, verse 9, it says, "But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage." So he basically is saying, okay, the nations, I've given them to the different angelic beings, but Israel is mine, and that is my heritage. And from that nation, God wanted the nations of the world to be blessed. And from that nation, that one nation of Israel, the nations of the world would see what it would be like when God rules. Remember at Babel, the bigger issue was that human beings wanted to go their own way and to find their own way to worship God, to do their own thing. And God then said, okay, I'll allow you to do your own thing, and you can run things in the way you want to, and assigned them to lesser beings. Now, the language in the New Testament begins to be principalities and powers. The Gentiles are under principalities and powers. So when Israel encounters the Gentiles, their gods and controlling spirits are often described as princes or kings, right? So that's the way in which Old Testament language would describe the spiritual beings that were over particular nations. So we read in the book of Daniel, chapter 10, verse 12 to 13. "Then he said to me, Fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before God, your words have been heard, and I've come because of your words. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia. So this is a description. Daniel is given a description of what happened to this angel that had a message. He was dispatched from heaven and he was to give the message to Daniel, but then he was stopped by the prince of the kingdom of Persia. The prince of the kingdom of Persia. And Michael, one of the chief princes, okay, that's the way he describes it, one of the chief princes came to help me. How is it that he was able to now get through? Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help. And that's how he broke through. So there was a resistance to the message that God had given to Daniel by a spirit to actually stop that message getting to Daniel. So there is a principality power over a nation in that sense. We see another example in Ezekiel chapter 28. I'm not going to read that, but if you want to read Ezekiel chapter 28, you'll see that from verse 1 to 10, it's talking about the prince of Tyre, who is human. And this human being is influenced by the king of Tyre, who is described from verse 11 to 19. And from verse 11 to 19 of chapter 28 in Ezekiel, you now hear about the king of Tyre. And the king of Tyre was in Eden. Eden, book of Genesis. And the way the king of Tyre is described is not human. So you need to be able to see that the nations behind the nations are these evil influences. They were created by God, but they have rebelled against God, and they are leading the nations in their own way and in directions that God has not desired for the nations. But because the nations want to go their own way, God allowed them to be ruled by different spirit beings, and some of these spirit beings have rebelled totally against God, and they are leading the nations in a rebellious direction opposite to what God would want for them. So it's an important little thing that I want you to understand there as we read the book of Acts, that we are not just dealing at human level, but we are dealing with principalities and powers. Israel, they understood themselves as the people of God, and they were to bring the good news, or the message of the gospel, the Old Testament gospel. They were the ones who were entrusted with it to bring it to the nations and to make the other nations know about God. That is now our charge as the people of God in the New Testament. So I will continue with this series. It's a two-part series. I'll continue with it in the next session.